Welcome to part 5 of the digital map case build, and today we are finally going to get to see a version of the finished product. So far, we've covered what a digital map case is, what materials you need, how to cut the lumber, and how to assemble the frame. I even added a bonus video of how you can engrave your project with or without a big fancy laser engraver. So make sure to go check out parts 1 through 4 if you haven't already. Today, we'll be adding the TV mount and the support to the case, as well as the small rubber feet that will protect your table and lift it to allow some of that heat to get out from under the TV. All right, enough chatter. I'm not even going to ask you to comment or subscribe today because you probably wouldn't anyway. I mean, you probably could during the intro.
Is it real or just a dream? It's time for MooreDnD. A world of danger mystery.
The first thing that we're going to need is the lumber that we've already cut for the mount and the support, which you can see in parts 2 and 3 of the series. Next, we're going to need the TV bolts and the washers. Now, I talked in part 2 about how you can get a variety pack of these TV bolts right from Walmart, and in our case here, it actually did come with the bolts that we would need for the TV. The problem is, I bought that pack back when I did my own digital map case, and the bolts that I use for that are the exact ones I would need here. So rather than me going back out and buying a whole new pack, I instead looked at the user manual to find out exactly which bolts I need, and went out and bought those from Home Depot. Now, the user manual says that we need the M6 sized bolts, and it also specifies 8mm being the max depth into the TV that it would go. Now, we know that the mounting material that it's going to is a 1/2 inch thick, or around 13mm. Now, if we add those together, we get 21mm, or around 20mm, which is the length of the bolt that we're going to be looking for. So I headed off to Home Depot, went to the fastener aisle, and I found in the drawers of the special fastener section the exact bolt we were looking for. I also found the washers right next to it. Now, one thing to note, if you're using a different TV than I am, you may have different bolts that you need to use, so just refer to your user manual before you go out and buy them. Now, the next thing we'll use is a liquid marking material, which for me is just acrylic paint. It doesn't really matter what you use because all we're doing with it is putting it on the head of the bolts, then putting the bolts in the TV and laying our mount down on top of that to tell us exactly where we need to drill holes for the bolts. So this part really isn't necessary. You instead could just use your tape measure to get a whole bunch of measurements and find out exactly where those holes need to go. I'm just taking the easy way out. Speaking of drilling, next we're going to need our drill or a drill press if you happen to have one of those, and a drill bit that is the right size to make a hole big enough for the bolts that you're going to use. In our case, that's a 1/4 inch drill bit, but again, if you're using a different TV that might need different bolts, make sure you check what drill bit you need for those. Now, the next tool is not necessary, but it's going to make my life easy, so I'm going to use it. That's a Kreg jig, and a Kreg jig is for making nice diagonal holes at the end of a board that's going to be affixed to something perpendicular. Now, of course, once we have our diagonal holes, we're going to need the screws to fasten the support and the mount to our frame. I'm going to be using those 1 1/4 inch long construction screws we talked about in part 2. And finally, I'm going to be using our wood glue again as we fasten these pieces to the frame just to give our project a little bit more strength and support. But that should be it. If there's anything that I missed, we'll go over that as we're working outside, which means I guess it's time to go brave the cold to the shop. All right, we are out in the workshop, and I believe the thermometer said it's 21 degrees out here, so it's freezing, which means we get a nice little fireplace that I put out here to keep me warm while we go over this. Now, as you might be seeing, I have my mount here, and I have my support here. I wanted to put it in to make sure that it fit before we started this whole process. The mount fit perfect. The support did not, and that's because instead of me measuring it with a tape measure, I had actually used the thickness of the boards that I ended up messing up with in my last video, if you saw, to cut this part. So I went and recut a new one. But now they both fit perfectly. Let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing we're going to do is take these out and put the bolts in the back of the TV so we can get ready to use the paint to mark our mount here. Well, that was interesting. 2 of the bolts go way further in than the other 2 bolts do. Not a big deal, just something to note. I'm actually going to back those out so that way they're close to the same height, so when we lay our board down, it's not really angled. Okay, next I'm going to take my paint and I'm just going to put a little drop of paint on each of the heads. Then I'll grab the big board and lay it down into the case so that all 4 heads touch the board, and that's going to give us our marks for where to drill the holes. All right, next we're gonna take our board here. We're gonna get it as centered as we can with the bolts, so that way the bolts aren't more towards one side than the other, and then we're gonna slowly lay it down, making sure that at least one of the ends of this mount here is up against the inside wall. That way it's in the right spot. Then you just make sure you press down on all 4 corners. That way if some of your bolts are higher than the other, it's not missing any of the droplets. And then we lift. And there you have it. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's the 4 yellow dots. So we're just gonna try and drill our holes right in the center of those. And then of course, if you don't like the yellow on top of the bolts, you can come back with a paper towel and wipe off the paint. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and pull the bolts out because we don't need them in there right now. We're actually gonna need them out when we go to put the mount in. Okay, and as I mentioned, we're gonna either use a drill or a drill press. I do have a drill press, but it's a lot easier, I think, in this instance to just use the drill. But we're gonna go ahead and put our 1/4 inch drill bit inside of here and get to it. Make sure that when you're drilling through the board, you're not over top of something that you don't want a hole in it. Otherwise, you're gonna be pretty upset afterwards. Okay, before we attach the mount, we're actually gonna have to attach the support first because we won't be able to get it under the mount once the mount is bolted in. So that means we're gonna have to add those diagonal holes now. So let's go over what the Kreg jig is and how it works. I'm using the handheld Kreg jig, which is honestly one of the harder to use of all the options. They have ones that actually mount to your tabletop, which are way easier. But this handheld one comes with 3 primary parts. The first one we're gonna talk about is the drill bit itself. This drill bit has a skinnier part at the tip, which is essentially the pilot hole we talked about before. And then it's got the bigger bit, which is used for boring into the wood to allow the screw to go further in before it hits the stopping point. Now at the bottom of this specialized bit, there is a collar, and that collar needs to be set to whatever the thickness of the wood you're drilling into is. You do not set this to the thickness of the wood that it's attaching to. So for instance, we're attaching a 1/2 inch mount to a 3/4 inch frame. We're gonna set this collar to a 1/2 inch because that's what we're drilling into. The next part is this plastic piece that your drill bit goes into. You'll see there are 2 holes, one here and one here. That's just so you can do it multiple times before you have to move this over. But these holes are angled, and this is what is going to guide your drill bit at the correct angle for the wood that you're going into. This is braced on the bottom up against the wood itself, and then you use a clamp to clamp it down to the piece, which we'll talk about in a second. This also has a setting for the thickness of the wood that you're going into. So this too will be set to 1/2 inch, which I've already done. And finally, the clamp I was just talking about, and this thing's kind of clunky to be honest, but you attach the plastic piece we were just looking at on the top, clamp it down to your piece of wood, pressing the little feet up against the edge of the wood, and then you can drill your holes in. Since both of these are already set, I'll go ahead and show you how it works now, starting with the support. Okay, one quick fix. I know I just said 1/2 inch if I'm doing the mount. Since I'm starting with the support, this is 3/4 inch. So I've changed the 2 settings to be 3/4, not 1/2. So on the bottom of this, you can see these 2 little gray feet that act as guides for the edge of your board. We're gonna line this up with the center of our support here, push it forward, and then we're gonna close the clamp down on the end of the board. Now that's clamped down, it's not going anywhere, but if your clamp was too loose or too tight, there is a setting underneath that you can move back and forth to tighten it or loosen it up. Now once that's in, you have your drill bit set to 3/4 inch. You're gonna put it in your drill, stick it in one of the holes that you're gonna use, and start drilling. I'm gonna do 2 on either side, so we'll go ahead and do the next hole. Okay, now you can take this off, and there you have it. 2 prepped diagonal holes for you to then put screws into to go into the perpendicular board that you're attaching to. We're gonna go ahead and do this to the other side, and then I'm gonna do this on a couple spots on the mount. Oh. I literally just dropped this and broke one of the gray feet off. I'm telling you, these manual ones, clunky. Don't know if I'd recommend them. It's supposed to make my life easier, but that kind of hurt my feelings. We've got the holes in, now we got to get it attached to the frame. We're going to be using, as I mentioned, these 1¼ inch long construction screws that I got from Home Depot. They've got the star head. So I've got my drill for that. I also have the glue ready to go because we're going to put some glue on the end of this before we put it in. Now, one thing to note, as you put your support in, make sure that you're not pushing down, because you got to remember we're still working with the TV here. But there's also a second reason not to push down. When you are going diagonally into the frame and you are pulling this support into the frame, because you're pulling diagonally, it's going to want to bring this support into the TV more. If you attach the support really, really tight when you go to flip the TV, that support is going to stop flexing and flatten out a little bit and lift your TV up kind of out of the box. So just make sure you're not pushing too hard, you're not adding any extra strength or pressure onto this board here. And then just try and keep it straight as you screw it in. Okay, we've got the support in. Let's go ahead and get them mounted. We're gonna start with bolting it into the TV, and then we'll go ahead and screw it into the frame.
1 hour later.
Okay, 2 of those bolts did not want to go in for the life of me, but I did finally get them, and now we're gonna go ahead and tighten them with something I did forget to mention as far as a tools list goes, which is this ratchet and this 10mm socket. The 10mm happens to just fit the bolts that I got. Again, if you got different bolts, it may be a little different for you. Now let's screw them out to the frame. Okay, she is secured. Now, as much as I want to flip it over and see what it looks like, I do want to put the little rubber feet on the bottom first. Now, I have these little rubber feet that I got off Amazon. I got them in a 100-pack back when I was doing a lot of woodworking, and they're about 1/4 of an inch deep. They come with these little screws to put in there, so I'm gonna use this really, really tiny drill bit that I'm sure you could barely see there. But I'm gonna use that little drill bit to drill some pilot holes in each of the corners and then one in each of the middle of the long ends. Then I'll screw in the feet and we'll be all done and ready to flip it over and see what it looks like. So let's go ahead and do it. All right, 6 rubber feet are on, the support and the mount are attached to the frame. It is finally time to flip this thing over and see what it looks like. Okay, it looks really good. The only problem is exactly what I mentioned might happen before, is when I put in the screws on the side of the frame, it did push the TV up a little bit. So I am gonna have to flip it over and adjust that. And that essentially just entails undoing the screws, adjusting the positioning a little bit, and then pushing it back in, which might be a problem with the glue I put on the support. All right, she is pretty even all the way around now. It's not perfect, but it's okay. It's something that you really never notice unless you're the one that made it, then you're the one that's gonna notice. But it looks great. The TV still works, even having been on the screen for as long as it has at this point. But this is awesome. And of course, now we can go take off all the saran wrap from the screen and get that nice, pretty look. Woo! She's looking pretty. And there you have it. This thing has come out amazing so far. Realistically, you could end the project right now because at this point, you hook it up to your laptop, you put a battle map up, and you're ready to go. But we're gonna take it a step further and we're gonna finish this wood to make it real nice and pretty before we give it away. I mean, look at this thing. You can see my reflection in the TV. Anyway, stick around for part 6 where we'll go over multiple ways that you could finish this wood. I'm gonna use polyurethane, and then after that, I'm just gonna go over how to hook this thing up and start using it. And if you're really liking this content, don't forget to subscribe. That way you get the notification when that video comes out, and tell me in the comments, what do you want to see me make next?